So hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. My name's Allison Jessing. I'm the head of adult curriculum at Howard County Library System. We're here tonight to learn more about the history of voting in our democracy and share information with you about your rights and role as a voter. I really would like to thank our special guests, Dr. Richard Bell and Linda Frascarella, Director of Education for League of Women Voters of Howard County, for joining us tonight. And I also want to thank Worcester County Library System for their support in this program. Dr. Richard Bell is a professor of history at the University of Maryland. He is the author of Stolen: 5 Free Boys Kidnapped into Slavery and Their Astonishing Odyssey Home, which is a finalist for the 2020 Harriet Tubman Book Prize. He serves as a trustee of the Maryland Historical Society and as a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. The League of Women Voters of Howard County is committed to improving local government by making the processes of decision-making more transparent and including more options for community engagement. I'm going to throw some links into the chat that will direct you to the Howard County Library System's voter resource page, as well as Dr. Bell's website and the League of Women Voters website. We're going to begin tonight with a presentation from Dr. Bell and then have time for a Q&A with him and Ms. Frascarella at the end. So as you think of questions, drop them into the chat box and I'll read them out loud toward the end, and we'll cover as many as we can in the time we have together tonight. So Richard, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
All right, well, good evening again, everyone. And thank you to Ali and thank you to Linda for this opportunity to share, I guess, a virtual stage with all of you this evening. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, give or take, and then we're going to turn things over to Q&A as Ali mentioned. So do not hesitate. At any point a question comes into your mind, pop it in the Q&A box or in the chat if you prefer, and we will try to make sure we address it. And while I know some things about the past, Linda is here for many reasons, one of which is that she knows a lot more about the present and how voting works now than I do. So hopefully we'll be a good team. So I want to begin by telling you a bedtime story, a fairy tale about the history of voting in America. And I should say as a preface that I am a proud 14-year resident of the great state of Maryland, and despite this accent, I'm a naturalized US citizen who has already voted and was very excited to do it. And the views that I'm going to express tonight are my own views. They are not the views of Howard County government or of its library system. So the bedtime story I want to tell you is a story of struggle, followed by hard-won success, of an electoral franchise that grows fuller and fairer over time as Americans fight to build a more perfect union. It's a story, a bedtime story, a fairy tale that begins after the American Revolution, when only white men with sufficient land or property had the right to vote. Democracy back then was actually a dirty word that summoned images of mob rule and chaos. And the Constitution left it up to individual states to set the rules for who could vote and who could not. Still, laboring white men would press their case to be granted the right to vote, citing their contributions to the American economy and to the ranks of its armed forces. It would be an uphill battle, but intensifying competition between political parties and the growth of the population in ever more bustling cities like Baltimore would help working men's cause. And by 1850 or so, most states in our union had dismantled both property requirements and tax-paying requirements, thereby allowing any white man to vote in America. In this bedtime story, this fairy tale, the Civil War is the second great watershed. Long excluded from voting on the basis of racist notions that African Americans were inferior, uncivilized, ill-equipped to make informed political decisions, Black people's efforts to free themselves from slavery during the Civil War propelled a national reckoning about their right to vote after the fighting in that war was over. As Frederick Douglass, the greatest Marylander, would memorably put it, slavery is not abolished until the Black man has the ballot. And under the terms of the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, African Americans finally got something long overdue, a full federal guarantee of citizenship. Then 2 years later, in 1870, under the terms of the 15th Amendment, African Americans secured the all-important right to vote as well. In the years immediately before the Civil War, only about half a dozen states had permitted any Black people to vote. But now, in 1870, African Americans' right to vote was enshrined in the Constitution for all to see. It was a fundamental shift in power and a radical departure for American government. As the anti-slavery activist William Lloyd Garrison would put it, nothing in all history equals this wonderful, quiet, sudden transformation of 4 million human beings from auction block to ballot box. Throughout the South, freed people rushed to exercise their precious new rights as citizens, and the vast majority of eligible African Americans registered to vote. In the elections that followed, freed people, former slaves, voted other people of color into all sorts of elected offices for the first time in US history. In the post-Civil War South, their votes sent 14 African Americans to the House of Representatives and 2 African Americans to the United States Senate, both of them representing, wait for it, the state of Mississippi. The third act of my bedtime story, my fairy tale, takes place less than half a century later in 1920, when the franchise will expand again, this time to include American women. The Constitution would once more be amended, this time to guarantee, quote, that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. The passage of this 19th Amendment was the result of decades-long efforts for female suffrage that had included peaceful petitions, as well as dangerous, highly visible public protests. And again, the result would prove transformative, lifting tens of millions of female citizens and female wage earners, most of whom had contributed actively to World War I, into the American voting rolls in a single stroke. The fourth and final act in this soothing 4-act drama took place in the context of World War II. The American right to vote would expand yet again, first via a string of wartime measures to enshrine military service as a path to citizenship and to voting rights, and second, to nationalize the use of mail-in ballots for soldiers stationed overseas. Then, during the civil rights era of the 1960s, the federal government would strike down anti-Black voter suppression efforts in the Deep South and turn America's long trumpeted democratic values into vibrant reality. Soon after that, during mass protests against the Vietnam War in the early 1970s, Americans would vote to ratify a 26th Amendment, this time to lower the national voting age from 21 down to 18. Finally, in the 1990s, Congress would act again, removing the last nagging obstacles to voter registration and thereby adding 9 million new registrants to the American electorate. In this simple 4-part fairy tale about the history of the right to vote, there's even a happy ending. That happy ending tells us that ultimately, after 200 years of struggle, we in America have succeeded in removing virtually all formal restrictions on the voting rights of adult citizens. Now in 2020, every adult citizen in the US who wants to vote can do so. As Martin Luther King famously said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Folks, what I've said so far tonight is probably a familiar story. It's the comforting, uplifting version of events that we hear so often in our politicians' speeches, in popular culture, and in our national mythology. Liberals and conservative alike have imagined the story of the United States as a gradual unfolding of freedom, But that doesn't mean it's true, because myth and history are not the same thing. And I believe the story that I've told you so far tonight is at best a half-truth that obscures almost as much as it reveals. The missing half of this story would point out that white laboring men's voting gains after the revolution came at the expense of several other groups who saw their own voting rights severely restricted or entirely retracted at the same time. In New Jersey, for instance, some white women there had enjoyed the right to vote since 1790. But in 1807, those New Jersey women lost that right, one of the earliest acts of suffrage retraction in US history, and many more would follow. In the first decades of the 1800s, one state after another would rewrite its laws to lengthen residency requirements in order to prevent paupers and newly arriving European migrants from voting in US elections, even as those same legislators extended the right to vote to more native-born white workers. Here in Maryland, for instance, state legislators adopted a new 6-month residency requirement in the early 1800s that targeted the newly arrived immigrant population of Baltimore like a laser and excluded them. Legislators here and their counterparts in at least 5 other states also debated imposing English literacy tests to further suppress the immigrant vote at that time. At the same time, legislators were moving to explicitly bar free Black people from voting. In Maryland and in New Jersey and Connecticut, free Black men had enjoyed the right to vote right after the revolution. But by 1820, legislators here and in those other 2 states had retracted that right. And other states, including our neighbor Pennsylvania, would do exactly the same thing a decade or so later. The full story of the right to vote in America would also treat the period following the Civil War quite differently. Now, we sometimes regard those decades in the 1860s and 1870s as our electoral jubilee, the moment when racial justice was first and finally achieved. In truth, though, those years between the Civil War and World War I were some of the darkest in our nation's political history. A golden age of voter intimidation and of voter suppression, in which Southern whites most especially worked tenaciously to defend their own interests and exclude from voting those they regarded as inferior or incapable of exercising that right responsibly. And Maryland, remember, is in the South. And Maryland is sadly a case in point. While 2/3 of American states did ratify the 14th Amendment in 1867 and 1868, white Maryland voters actually rejected it. And voters here did not endorse the concept of automatic citizenship for Black people born in this country until 1959. Note too that the Constitution's 15th Amendment, the one that guarantees African Americans' right to vote, would do nothing to stop federal and state legislators from suppressing the political participation, the right to vote, of the Irish, or the Chinese, or of Native Americans, or of white Americans who were illiterate. What's more, that 15th Amendment, of course, did not enfranchise Black women, or white women either. It applied only to Black men. And even that guarantee of suffrage rights to them was not adequately enforced. Southern state legislators found ways around that 1870 amendment to the Constitution almost immediately. And they succeeded in deterring Black men from exercising their new rights by gerrymandering districts, by closing polling places. That might sound familiar to some of you. Those legislators also imposed lengthy residency requirements, secret ballot laws, literacy tests, elaborate registration systems, poll taxes, confusing multiple voting box arrangements, and primaries that effectively were restricted to white voters. They also passed laws excluding from voting those convicted of even the most trifling of crimes. And all the while, the federal government stood by and watched. In fact, the Supreme Court actually upheld the legality of almost all of the techniques of disenfranchisement that I just listed. Beyond the state houses, thousands of ordinary white men across post-Reconstruction America organized themselves into paramilitaries like the KKK to terrorize Black voters. They killed hundreds of freedmen, and they injured and terrorized many, many more. Almost exactly 100 years ago, on November the 2nd, 1920, a white mob in a town near Orlando, Florida, actually massacred 35 Black voters on election day to stop them from voting in the presidential election. The single bloodiest day of violence in American election history. Here in Maryland, there were dozens of lynchings in the decades after the end of the Civil War, all of them of Black men. By these means, white racists succeeded in largely suppressing the voting rights of African-American men for the best part of a century. And many of those same people were no less outraged by the prospect that new arrivals, especially Chinese immigrants, might be voting in large numbers. So they threw their support behind candidates for federal office who were promising to curb immigration, to raise barriers to naturalization. The practical result of all that was that between the Civil War and the start of World War I, voting rights in our country, the United States, effectively contracted. Given that context, it shouldn't surprise any of us that women's suffrage took so many decades to accomplish. The campaign for women's voting rights had begun back in the 1830s, but it took, 90 years of activism to achieve the passage of that 19th Amendment in 1920. Female activists before the Civil War had assumed that they would get the vote when Black men did in the late 1860s after the Civil War. But many white men thought otherwise, thought it was not their time. One question at a time, chided the anti-slavery activist Wendell Phillips. One question at a time. This hour belongs to the Negro, he said. It's not your turn. Indeed, folks, I would argue that the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868 actually set women back decades because it added the word male, M-A-L-E, male, to its guarantee of who could claim political rights in America. Its sequel, the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, did much the same, implicitly condoning political discrimination based on sex. As a result, women were left out in the cold for the rest of the 19th century, usually on the grounds that they lacked the intelligence to participate in politics, or that their participation as voters would degrade their moral purity. As one white Californian man put it in 1879, quote, "I believe that women occupy in many respects a higher position than men, and I, for one, do not wish to drag them down from that exalted sphere." I say, give me a break. Even when the political winds finally shifted in the wake of World War I, male voters in many states balked. Here in Maryland, a majority of male voters opposed the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. In fact, it took 40 more years for our state to ratify that amendment, granting women the vote and to certify the results. All the while, voter suppression and voter disenfranchisement continued apace. Southern whites piled up ever more rules and restrictions designed to impede Black voting. And as a result, the percentage of African-American men and women in Southern states who registered to vote never exceeded 15% of those eligible. By 1940, laws requiring voter registration were basically universal, and some state legislators had actually begun to talk about taking away voting rights from anyone who might be unemployed. The aftermath of World War II and the resulting civil rights movement did see marked gains in voting rights for soldiers and for veterans. But bear in mind that the justly celebrated Voting Rights Act of 1965 did not aim to expand voting rights. Instead, it merely, simply tried to enforce rights already guaranteed to Black voters by the 15th Amendment, passed almost 100 years earlier in 1870. No piece of legislation passed since World War II has succeeded in putting an end to racial discrimination in American politics. Discrimination against certain classes of voters continues and thrives. In the early 1990s, when Congress was debating the plan to overhaul voter registration rules to make it easier to register to vote, during that debate, a senator from Kentucky, don't make me name him, he's still there, led the fight to block those reforms. That senator from Kentucky actually claimed that low turnout in federal elections was a sign not of high barriers to voter registration, but a sign of great and widespread happiness about the state of the nation. Low turnout, this senator from Kentucky said, is a sign of a content democracy. This was and is, folks, a claim with no basis in fact. Statistics show that America's massive non-voting population is generally comprised of the poor, of minorities, of young people, and of those less well-educated. That is, the people who are the least contented, precisely the people who have the most to gain by expressing their own political interests via the ballot box. And their numbers as non-voters are large and growing. The United States has the worst voter turnout of any Western democracy. In America today, only half of all eligible voters cast ballots in presidential elections, no matter how high the stakes, no matter how urgent the cause. I would argue that that is not because non-voters are satisfied with the status quo. I would argue it is because of the obstacles that make voting in this country unnecessarily hard, and because the impact of our votes is often uncertain. I would argue that we live in an America where voter suppression is still very much a way of life, where the right to vote still hangs in the balance, and where most individual votes stand almost no chance of affecting electoral outcomes. To explain myself, consider first the persistence of gerrymandering, a practice with a long history in this country. Efforts to draw voting districts in ways that advantage certain groups and disadvantage others go back to the American Revolutionary era. That term, that word, gerrymandering, is actually named for Elbridge Gerry, a Massachusetts politician who redrew state Senate districts in 1812 to favor his own party. And gerrymandering has been going on here ever since. In 1990, state legislators in North Carolina redrew congressional district boundaries there to push most Black voters in the state into just 2 of those districts, even though it meant drawing one of those districts in such a way that it snaked along the median of 160 miles of interstate highway to lump together the Black populations of Charlotte and Durham. And if you know your North Carolina geography, you know those 2 places are not anywhere near each other. Such blatant racial gerrymandering was only ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1993. And political gerrymandering, trying to get most Republicans or Democrats into a single district, still remains lawful today. In fact, I am sad to report that Maryland is a poster child for political gerrymandering. Our state representatives have drawn congressional maps that make it almost impossible for voters here in Maryland to flip their congressional districts, either from Republican to Democrat or from Democrat to Republican, effectively suppressing all of our votes. And the Electoral College, folks, does the same thing, but of course at the national level. The Constitution stipulates that the vote for the president is a national vote. And yet, because of the warping, disenfranchising effects of the Electoral College, some voters have much more power than others. For example, there are, I believe, about 4.6 eligible voters, I'll start that again, 4.6 million eligible voters in Maryland this year. 4.6 million. In contrast, the great state of Wyoming has a voting age population that is only 10% as large. Yet because of the Electoral College, those Wyoming voters have voting power equal to 30% of Maryland's voting power. In this direct comparison, each Wyoming voter has the equivalent of 3 Marylanders' votes. That distortion effect is found across all the states, boosting the voting power of those in low population states and stifling the voting power of those in high population states. And worse still, statewide winner-take-all laws, like we have in Maryland and many other states, mean that most states award all of their electoral votes in presidential elections to the candidates with the most votes statewide. The effect of that, of course, is to erase from national electoral college calculations all of the voters in a state who do not vote for the candidate who wins that state. So Republican voters in Maryland, for instance, or Democratic voters in Texas, for instance, they are, by such means, prevented from affecting the national outcome in presidential elections. It is as if they never voted at all. No surprise then that it is not always the case that the candidate with the most votes across the nation wins. Because of the Electoral College, the candidate who lost the national popular vote by 3 million ballots in 2016 still won the White House. And that has happened 4 times so far in American history. It could easily happen again. It could happen again this year. Consider next, and I'm starting to wrap up, don't worry. Consider next all the adult US citizens who have had their right to vote formally stripped away from them. According to the Sentencing Project, 6.1 million American citizens cannot vote in this fall's election because of a prior felony conviction. That is 1 out of every 40 American citizens of voting age. In Maryland, anyone doing time is barred from voting. And in the vast majority of other states, that ban extends to people on probation and on parole as well. If any of you guys have seen the documentary on Netflix called 13th, or if you've read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, then you probably already understand the racial dimensions of felon disenfranchisement. America's half-century-old war on drugs has swept more and more Black people into our prisons, incarcerating them for petty drug offenses for which they are still disproportionately punished when compared to white defendants committing similar crimes. As a result, our prisons are bursting with Black people, most of them young and male, who cannot vote and who in many cases will never be able to regain that right. This year, 2020, 1 out of every 13 voting age African Americans is barred from voting due to felony disenfranchisement, a huge disparity compared to the 1 out of every 56 non-Black voters barred from voting for the same reason. There is no defensible rationale for any of this. Barring those convicted of crimes from voting does not deter crime. It does not prevent crime. It is not a suitable or fitting punishment for most offenses, which is to say it's not proportional, and it certainly does not directly incentivize rehabilitation or accelerate it. Yet the practice continues, and this fall, 6.1 million Americans will not be able to vote because of it. Indeed, obstacles to voting rights and to voting equality are everywhere, and they still seem to be multiplying. In 2013, not that long ago, 2013, our Supreme Court gutted the 1965 Voting Rights Act, freeing states with the worst histories of voting discrimination from any further federal oversight. Likewise, since about 2010, half of the states in this country have between them enacted more than 400 new voting restrictions, making it harder for their own citizens to vote. Just last month, the governor of Tennessee signed into law a bill that made political protest on state property a criminal offense that would be punished by stripping peaceful protesters of their right to vote. In several other states, we've recently seen governors and Secretary of State shrink early voting hours and early voting days, ban Sunday voting, and repeal same-day registration. We've seen boards of elections slash the number of polling stations, drop boxes, and machines in certain districts, and add new voter ID and exact name match requirements for in-person voting that amounts to disenfranchisement by typo. And there's more. There's the selective refusal to translate balloting materials into common non-English languages, the purges of the voter rolls, the lack of funding to properly manage elections, the creation of at-large seats that aren't tied to specific voting districts. Legislators in the United States can no longer legally use literacy tests or poll taxes. So these new restrictions are subtler. They rarely invoke race, age, place of birth, or economic status directly. And yet they achieve the same effect of once again making voting in America seem like a privilege and not a fundamental right. By disproportionately suppressing turnout by minorities, by youths, by new citizens, and by the poor, these quiet waves of state legislation amount to what one past president of the NAACP has called the greatest attacks on voting rights since segregation. Folks, this is what voter suppression looks like in America today, in October 2020. It is dangerous and it is malevolent. The right to vote in this great country has never been a sure thing. And the evolution of the franchise has never followed a straight path. As voters, I think we have a duty to exercise the rights we have. And as citizens, I think we have a duty to make sure that as many other Americans enjoy and exercise those rights as well. Because the right to vote is the oxygen of our democracy. And without a broad franchise and without easy access to the ballot box, we may not be a democracy at all. As Congressman John Lewis wrote a few days before his death, quote, "Democracy is not a state, it is an act. So folks, please act and please vote." Thanks very much indeed.
And on that note, I will share information on the Howard County early voting locations. This is also in the chat. The URL is in the chat. So in Howard County, Maryland, we do have early voting, which runs from October 26th through November 2nd. At this point, if you have not requested a mail-in or absentee ballot, you did that you will be doing in-person voting. So again, early voting, October 26th through November 2nd. And these are the locations. It's also available on the Howard County Board of Election website. And Maryland has fortunately passed a law a couple years ago, I believe, where we now have same-day voter registration. So if you did miss the October 13th deadline to get your voter registration in, you can vote in person and register the same day. You will need to bring some type of ID, some Maryland issued license, an ID card, change of address card, paycheck, et cetera, et cetera. So it's important to vote. I think Dr. Richard Bell made that clear. And here's a little bit of information on how you can vote. Thank you.
So if you have questions, please feel free to throw them into the Q&A so we can answer those. We have two amazing resources here with us this evening. And while we're waiting for one to come in, Linda, I'll ask you, because I've been checking the link that I'll throw into the chat here, the voter search link to where you can track the status of your ballot online. I dropped off my ballot about 2 weeks ago. I just took it right to the Board of Elections Dropbox, popped it right in on my lunch hour, was home in 15 minutes. It was great, super easy. Got an email within 24 hours saying your ballot has been secured, it's received. And now when I check that link that I just threw into the chat, I haven't seen the status change. So I know they have the ballot. When will I see that it's updated to have been counted or processed?
All right, so this is the screen you're talking about. I looked my own up, so I'm not going to open this up and share my personal information. But it does take them a little bit of time to update this. So I probably mailed mine in. You said you did yours a week or so ago?
Yeah.
I did mine maybe a couple days before that, and mine now says ballot received. So they're processing them as quickly as possible. I love the fact that you can check the status. This is fantastic. And really, if you did request the absentee ballot, hurry up and get it in that Dropbox so you can get the confirmation.
So I shouldn't be worried if I see my status remain ballot received?
No.
Okay. Is there a process if my ballot is rejected for any reason? Is there an appeal, or will I receive an explanation for why it might not have been counted?
I do not have the answer to that question. I believe there is a process, but I would be uncomfortable communicating it. You should get an email if you did the mail-in.
So contact the Board of Elections.
Yes, and that also information is right here.
Okay. Wonderful, thank you. So our next question, are there other democracies that do this better? Are there examples in other countries that maybe we could look at for how we manage our voting process?
Well, I think first of all, one of the things we've seen that's become very apparent this season, though it should have been apparent for much longer, is that within the different states of this union, there's extraordinary variation. I'm very happy to live in Maryland because I think right now Maryland is doing a lot of the right stuff in terms of its own rules. I think the Board of Elections in this state right now compares pretty favorably with the actions of other boards of elections in other states in this very diverse union, politically speaking, of ours. But yes, if we look around the world, we can see other democracies trying other things. And first of all, I don't think there's any perfect democracy anywhere, right? Every democracy, every country around the world which uses the democratic system has its flaws and its problems. And anyone who knows what the House of Lords is in my home country, Britain, knows that people in glass houses with British accents shouldn't throw stones about democracy or the lack thereof in other places. But two quick things about that, Ali. One is that people do track this. They do try to make assessments statistically of the relative freedom of voting, access to the ballot, or democracy, to put it under one word, of different countries. I think The Economist famously produces a democracy index every couple of years, when you can see all the countries in the world ranked by this stuff according to some metrics. I don't know exactly what the algorithm consists of, but access to the ballot, the lack of voter restriction laws is going to be part of that menu. And what we see most recently, the last time I saw this was 2019, is that the USA, of course, does not fare fairly well against other Western developed countries. If you think of Western Europe or Canada or Australia or New Zealand, you don't see the United States mentioned among them. You see the United States, I think, 25th on that list. And top of the table, for what it's worth, are the Nordic countries, Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, etc. And then we see other major Western European democracies like France and Australia a bit further down. And then the United States much further below that. Australia, I was on a Zoom call with some folks in Australia last night, believe it or not, and they were telling me, apropos of nothing, I did not raise this subject, we were talking about other things, that they could not believe that different states make their own voting rules in these United States, and that there could be such variation. They could not believe that the loser of a popular vote could become the winner of the White House. That's not, guess what, how they do things in the different provinces or territories of Australia. And one thing Australia is famous for, Ali, you may know this, is that they have mandatory voting requirements, right? That everyone is expected and required to vote. Otherwise, I think you pay a fine. I think it's a nominal fine. Let's say it's $40. I could be wrong on the number here. And at least the Australians I talked to thought that was eminently reasonable. I, as a non-specialist, also think that's eminently reasonable. But you know, we in this country are very attached to our notions of freedom and what the government's role in our lives is or should not be. So it's hard to imagine this is something that's going to come out of the next Congress anytime soon, which I think is sort of an unfortunate thing. And the last thing before I shut up is to say that given my criticism of the Electoral College, I'm really pleased to see that there is an initiative to try to do a workaround for the Electoral College to make sure that in future elections, the winner of the popular vote actually becomes the next president. That initiative is called nationalpopularvote.com. I'm not going to try to explain it because I'll get it wrong, but it's really interesting and clever. And I think 19 states in the union have already agreed to it. And so as soon as we get a few more, it will become the law of the land, and the Electoral College will effectively go away. And that would be a good day for American democracy.
And I just dropped a link to that site into the chat for anybody that might be interested. And apparently Maryland was the first state to sign on, so good for us. And I have some follow-up information. We have an election judge in the group tonight, and they share that if your ballot has a problem, like you didn't sign your oath or something like that, you will be contacted to let you know. So that answers my question. Maybe some of you were also wondering about that. What happens if your ballot is not counted for some reason? Okay, great. Do we have any other questions from our group tonight? All right. Well, I think that may wrap us up. If we don't have any other questions, I just really want to thank Richard and Linda for taking the time to join us tonight. I learned so much. I was absolutely fascinated. And I'm going to be sending out an email tomorrow with a survey to everyone who registered. And I'll include all the links that I put in the chat tonight. I'll put those in the email along with the reading recommendations and links to the books in our catalog, so you can borrow those or purchase them from one of our local independent bookstores in the area. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to Worcester County Library. Thanks Richard and Linda and League of Women Voters for your time tonight. We learned a lot. And thank you so much for all your work on this subject.